مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أعلن الرئيس ترامب مؤخرا أن البنتاغون سيخفض عدد الجنود الأمريكيين في العراق وأفغانستان ليصل إجمالي عدد الجنود في كل من هذين البلدين إلى نحو 2500 جندي، أي ما يساوي عدد رجال الشرطة الذين يحمون مترو الأنفاق في مدينة نيويورك. وهذا يختلف اختلافا كبيرا عن الأيام التي كان للولايات المتحدة فيها مئات الآلاف من الجنود في هذين البلدين يحاربون فيما سيشكل أطول حروب أمريكا عمدا. ما هو الحجم المناسب للجيش الولايات المتحدة وقواتها البحرية والجوية ومشاة بحرياتها؟ أين ينبغي أن يتم نشر هؤلاء الرجال والنساء الشجعان؟ كيف ينبغي أن يكونوا مستعدين لخوض حروب الغد لا معارك الأمس؟ هل من المفترض بنا أن ننفق المزيد من المال على التجنيد والتدريب والتعليم والتكنولوجيا والاستبكاء أم على الاستحقاقات قدام المحاربين؟ أم كما يقول البعض هل ننفق أكثر من اللازم بالفعل؟ الفترة الانتقالية بين الإدارات الرئاسية تشكل فرصة جيدة للتفكير بشأن بعض الأسئلة الجوهرية قبل أن يضطر المسؤولون المنشغلون إلى التآتي مع الأزمات الآجلة. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنناقش العنصر البشري في الجيش الأمريكي وسياساته مع خبيري شؤون الدفاع المرموقين Todd Wyler وبيتر بروكس. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Well, we have now begun officially and formally the process of presidential transition from the Trump administration to the incoming Biden administration. This transition is always a good time for reflection. So this week we're going to talk about defense policy regarding the armed forces of the United States. And I'm delighted to welcome Todd Wyler and Peter Brooks to take us into the depths of American defense policy. So gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's begin with looking back at the Trump administration for a moment. When you look at the Trump administration in terms of its defense policy, what would you say are the most important innovations? And I'll separately ask you in a moment, which one of those innovations do you think will last into the next administration, which is a bit of a separate question. So first, just what are the biggest changes that you think are the legacy of the Trump administration? Peter, let me begin with you.
Well, I think the Trump administration looked at things a little bit differently than your traditional defense policy people would. If you look at North Korea policy, for instance, it very much was a top-down sort of approach to diplomacy to reduce the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And people will decide whether that's been successful or not. I think another important thing was the recapitalization of the American armed forces after many, many years of war. Think about it, Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years now. And so some of the things regarding modernization of the armed forces, especially the equipment, also the creation of the Space Force, which I think will be something that the new administration will certainly look at. Its views towards Russia, its views towards treaties, for instance. Just the other day, we officially left the Open Skies Treaty, which is a confidence and security building treaty. Their New START was not, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was not, it's expiring in February, so it's all on the watch of the new administration. It was not renewed with the Russians. There's other treaties out there that are not defense related as well. So The administration had a number of challenges, and I think it was quite successful in fact, in dealing with ISIS. Had a tremendous challenge in dealing with that when it came into office, and I think it has done well there. The relationship with China, that's something that the Biden administration is certainly going to have to look at. It's been a bit more confrontational. The great power competition is a term of art that we're using today to describe the relationship with Russia and China, and of course Iran, which I would be remiss to not mention when we're speaking to a Middle Eastern audience. The decision to leave the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and its decisions of its policy of maximum pressure. So these are a lot of things that the Biden administration is certainly going to have to look at, decide whether they will continue those policies or take another direction. And one last point on that, Rob, is that events will dictate. You come into office, the world doesn't stop spinning. As somebody who joined the Bush administration 20 years ago, the world is spinning and you have to hit the ground running. So we'll see what events drive policy. But the transition team now is looking at things they want to keep and things they're going to want to change.
So, Todd, do you have a similar list of innovations of the Trump administration? And when you look at these items, or certainly the ones in defense policy, which do you think are going to outlive the end of the Trump administration, or which do you think are going to be changed pretty quickly by the incoming Biden team?
Well, I think from an international perspective, as Peter was pointing out, that modernization is certainly going to continue and is needed across the armed forces. So I think that's one item that we will see continue under the new Biden administration. I think the legacy that's sort of laid out there that where I think we'll see a complete, maybe not a complete 180, but close to it, will be what I call the confrontation and appeasement strategy, where we have been very confrontational over the past 4 years with allies and very appeasing to some of our former enemies. So I think that we'll see some adjustments in that policy, at least I hope so, moving forward. I think the era of getting back close with our NATO partners is about to begin and is a very important step forward. And hopefully, and we'll probably have a chance to discuss some of the other possibilities in the future. But I think from the Trump era, really modernization is key. Laying the groundwork for a new China policy, as Peter pointed out, it is a bit more confrontational there. But I do think that they were successful in some ways in advancing what was begun at the end of the Obama administration in terms of laying out a more aggressive strategy towards China.
So one area of commonality, actually, we heard it's in the Democratic Party platform, and it's something that President Trump likes to talk about all the time. That is ending America's endless wars, or ending forever wars. What does that actually mean in practice? We're down now to about 2% of where we were at one time in terms of our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Does that mean fully withdrawing the last American combat troops from those countries, or does it mean something else? Todd?
Well, I don't think that it means fully removing all troops from those areas. I think history shows us a lot that completely removing ourselves from those particular areas does not bode well for our future. And obviously, we end up having to go back in some of those locations later in time. So I think that although I think a precipitous drawback at troops is going on and will continue to go on, I think that there is going to be a presence, whether it is the presence that President Trump is now advocating in the final days of his administration, or whether it's something a little larger, more like what we had there over the past few years. maybe something that the Biden administration will look at. But I don't think that is opposed to getting out of the forever wars.
If there's a sort of political consensus, at least out there, perhaps not necessarily among defense professionals, but in the political world, to shrink America's footprint in the Middle East, is there somewhere else where we should be sending troops and beefing them up, or should we just be bringing the boys and increasingly the girls home? Todd?
Well, I would take a little different approach on that, and not in terms of the forever war or an engagement in terms of military engagement, but I would look at engagement like what we saw in Partnership for Peace. I think that we're due for a second round of engagement with former Soviet republics and Eastern Bloc nations. Particularly over the past 4 years, there has been a resurgence of Russia aggression in the region, and I think that this is an opportunity for the United States to re-engage with those partners. I also think that another ripe area where the military can play a role is in producing something similar to a partnership outreach to our own hemisphere, to our Central American and South American partners, where I believe that a strong engagement across the administration and the different organizations, businesses, Justice Department, in going and engaging with these countries, much in the way that we did with the former Eastern Bloc countries, would be a very positive step forward for us. So those are the areas where I think that the Department of Defense can be helpful. And again, it's not in a combat role necessarily, but it's about how to build and run a military in a democratic environment. So I think that those are areas in the traditional sense. There will probably be more engagement in the Pacific Rim, and as Peter's pointed out, we've talked quite a bit about both in Korea and in how we will address China moving forward. But I do believe that refocusing efforts in Europe and in our own hemisphere should be a priority moving forward.
Interesting. Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Peter, any thoughts on this?
Look, I mean, we don't have that. We have troops overseas, as I said, to protect and advance American interests, and it would be incumbent upon the new administration to do a wholesale review of that.
When we come back after the break, I want to talk to you both about the state of our armed forces, about the men and women in uniform, and whether we're spending our dollars properly, and what we would do if we had a marginal dollar, or since we're talking about the Pentagon, a marginal few $1 billion to enhance and improve the readiness of the American armed forces. In just a moment. In our age of non-stop cable TV, following presidential candidates' every move, it's easy to forget there was a time not too long ago when we relied on old-fashioned reporters to tell the very human story of candidates on the campaign trail. The personalities, the decisions, the emotions, the highs and the lows, everything that goes into the process of bearing one's soul before American voters to convince them to send you to the White House. The first of these is still the best. Theodore H. White's original The Making of the President, 1960. White reported from within the campaign of John F. Kennedy for the first time in presidential history, revolutionizing how journalists cover this quadrennial political spectacle. There have been many great insider accounts of campaigns in the 60 years since White gave us a peek inside Kennedy's razor-thin victory over Richard Nixon. But if you want to understand modern presidential politics, that path-breaking book is a great place to start. Our guests again today include Todd Wyler. Todd is an Army veteran who served in senior Pentagon positions in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. A success in the private sector as well, Mr. Wyler is a decorated combat veteran of Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, where he served as an attack helicopter pilot. He's the author of the new book titled Untamed Equality. Also joining us is Peter Brooks. Peter's Senior Research Fellow for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counter-Proliferation at the Venerable Heritage Foundation. He brings to this job a range of experiences in national security, from his service in the United States Navy, retiring with the rank of commander, to stints with the National Security Agency, CIA, State Department, Defense Intelligence, Office of Naval Intelligence, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Office of the Vice President. In addition, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Bush administration. So lots of experience in today's program. So gentlemen, let me ask you about the state of the armed forces themselves. When you look at things like recruitment and readiness, are we in good shape today? Peter, begin with you.
Well, mine, I'd certainly like to put in a selfless plug, a shameless plug for the Heritage Foundation's new publication this year, which we do called the Index of U.S. Military Strength, and that's available online. It came out a few weeks ago. So I would recommend that readers take a look at this. And this goes through all of these issues, which we won't be able to do today. But, you know, there are things that still need to be done.
Todd, you focused on manpower affairs, a term that might be going out the window now that we have so many women in the military. How would you assess the state of readiness of our armed forces?
The state of readiness, I would say, is remains strong for our armed forces. Let me take a moment, though, and switch to a specific element of that readiness, and that's the personnel side of the house, the people, which is actually the strongest equipment that we have in our armed forces. Our military remains reflective of our society. And as everyone knows, today our society is very divided. We're facing a lot of challenges. And the next leadership team in the Pentagon is going to need to address that, because we have to function as a cohesive unit. So I think that at the same time we begin to move beyond what I call promoting diversity and really celebrate diversity and understand that diverse organizations and inclusive organizations are stronger organizations, including the military. The next leadership team needs to be able to do that and build a leadership ethos around those views, as well as removing the pillars of hate that remain in some of our locations around the country. So there's some steps to be done to help improve the persona, if you will, of the American military, and that includes one, celebrating diversity, but also reaching out to our families, making sure our military families are strong, and ultimately all that comes back to increasing the readiness of the military overall.
You're both veterans, one Army, one Navy. First of all, thank you both for your service.
Go Army, go Navy, beat Army, right?
There you
That's
go.
this weekend.
Look, Veterans Affairs are one of the most hotly politicized issues in American politics. Are we better off today in how we take care of our veterans than we were 4 years ago? What do we need to do to actually get it right? And I know this is a big topic, so I don't expect dissertations, but if you each have an idea here, then our viewers will be fascinated. Peter, I'll start with you and then come to Todd.
I have to say, I'm a veteran and the father of a veteran, as a matter of fact, an Army officer. So Army Navy's tough around here. The football game, which will be coming up. But you know, I would say we just have to continue to pay attention to these issues. I've not spent a lot of time, Rob, looking at Veterans Affairs issues, and I'm just recently coming into the Veterans Affairs side of things as a retiree. But I think it's important that we continue to pay attention. The Veterans Affairs medical system, I believe, is the biggest hospital system in the country, and it's critical that we pay attention and we do what we need to do to take care of our veterans for the service that they've given for our country.
Again, Todd?
I think there needs to be a closer relationship between the Department of Defense and the VA.
It's Veterans Affairs.
Yes, Veterans Affairs.
I do want to thank both of you, Todd Wyler, Peter Brooks, for helping us decipher the issues in defense policy that will certainly be on the agenda of the incoming Biden administration. Thank you for joining us on Untitled Washington. When Donald Trump gave his last State of the Union address, it came at one of the most divided and partisan moments in modern American history. Half the room, the Republicans, were on their feet most of the time, applauding. Half the room, the Democrats, sat in stony silence. But there was at least one moment of bipartisan cheering, when the president loudly declared his intention to bring home American troops and end what he called America's forever wars. Indeed, it is now an article of faith that Americans are weary of foreign adventure, that the toll of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan exhausted not just the national treasury, but the national will too. The call to end our endless wars is sure to get applause and even many votes. So it is with some trepidation that I declare myself to be a skeptic. Precisely which forever wars do we need to end? The United States currently has fewer than 5,000 troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan, numbers that will soon go down to 2,500. In Syria, where we are deployed in the northeast, and in a remote fort at a place called Tanif, we have about half that number. These troops fulfill vital military functions, training local soldiers, battling the remnants of al-Qaeda, using their presence to leverage the deployment of many times more soldiers from other countries and armies. Whatever we call what is happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria today, it stretches our vocabulary and historical memory to call it war. When we went to war in 1991 to liberate Kuwait, we sent 500,000 soldiers to the Gulf. That was certainly war. When we went to war to overthrow Saddam in 2003, we sent 150,000 troops to Iraq. That was certainly war. And at its height, the level of U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan reached just over 100,000. That was certainly war. Do we really mark the end of war as the termination of all U.S. military presence in a country? Can U.S. forces perform any duties in a conflict zone that doesn't get classified as part of an endless war? These are serious issues with real-world consequences for U.S. national security, the deployments of partner countries, and the security and stability of American allies. Reasonable, well-intentioned people may disagree. Now that our election is over and the work of putting together an administration has begun, I hope that serious people, Democrats, Republicans, and people like me who wear no party label at all, can discuss these issues soberly and dispassionately. The time for applause lines is past. The time for real policymaking is now upon us. بهذا نصل نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول مستقبل تواجد أمريكا العسكري في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.